Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani made a lot of promises during his election campaign. 1 year later, we ask Iranians, how is he doing? So there are always challenges with our audience in Iran actually being able to get online to watch this program, to join in the show. So Malika Bilal, digital producer of the stream, how are they doing with that challenge?
Well, on the one hand, we are hearing from Iranians inside Iran. On the other hand, it is difficult. So Kareem actually tweets us from Iran, and he describes what the biggest issues for him in Iran 1 year after Rouhani's presidency election. He says restricted access to the internet was one of them, and he went on to tell the stream how difficult it is for him to participate in this conversation, and we appreciate it. So for those of you at home, we want your participation as well. You can tweet us your questions and comments with hashtag AJStream.
So joining our conversation here in the studio, we have Reza Marashi, and Reza is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. Reza, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And we will hear so much more from you in just a moment.
Hi, my name is Shehla. I am an activist and I'm in the street.
You're a very cool person. Got that sorted. So more than 18 million Iranians chose Hassan Rouhani to be their president in Iran's 2013 elections. As the only moderate in the final list of mostly conservative presidential hopefuls, Rouhani described his win, I'm going to quote him here, as a victory of moderation and a commitment over extremism and ill temper, end of quote. His election campaign focused on the promise of change. He pledged better and more constructive engagement with the West, improving the economy, easing international sanctions. He also promised Iranians greater personal freedoms as well. So, more than a year later, how has President Rouhani done? So to help us talk about this, we're also joined by Mohammad Marandi. He's an associate professor of North American Studies at the University of Tehran. Gissou is a human rights lawyer and soon to be deputy director at the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. And Sharmine Narwani is a commentator and analyst covering the Middle East. So guests, welcome. Great to have you all here on board. I'm just going to ask you this, just a pop quiz to go around all of you. If you had to give President Rouhani a grade for the past year, what would that grade be? Reza?
I think I'd give him a B, but I say that not because I think he's doing an outstanding job, but I think that he faces probably the more obstacles than any other Iranian president that's come before him.
Right.
And understanding that, given what he's been willing to say at the podium and what he's been willing to do tangibly, because he has had some successes, I think, and compared to his predecessor, frankly, I think I'd give him a reasonably good grade, but it's hard to judge a president 1 year into his presidency.
Right, but B's not bad for a start. Okay, so Mohammed, sitting there in Tehran, in Iran, what would be your grade for your president?
I would give him a high grade. I can't say A or B. It would be somewhere in between. But I think he's done quite well for the first year.
Sharmine?
I concur with both the speakers. I think with what he has on his plate, he's done a pretty good job and shown a lot of initiative. And I think that counts a lot.
Bold enough to grade him?
Yeah, same, you know, a high B.
Ooh. Gissou, are you going to keep the average up, the grade average up, or not?
I don't think so. On a scale of 1 to 10, when it comes to foreign policy, I'd give him a 7. When it comes to the economy, I'd give him a 5. And when it comes to human rights and civil liberties, I'd give him a 3.
Let's just check in with what the community is saying.
Well, they are also giving their own grades. Iran LGBT says, compared to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's 8 years, the previous president, I give Rouhani 20 out of 20. Compared to Rouhani's campaign promises, though, 9 out of 20. And Reza Kareem, tweeting us from Iran, I read his tweet at the very beginning of the show. He also answers this question. He says 60 out of 100 because of reforming college, improving the economy, progress in nuclear talks, opposing forced hijab, defending minorities' rights, lots of positives there. So what are the positives for you?
Well, I think there are a couple. 3 stand out to me. 1, he's made improvements on the economy. to the extent that inflation is down. He's providing a greater level of hope, because there is a certain aspect of hope that requires economic stability.
So Reza, how did he do that? What were his policies that actually did that?
Well, I think putting competent managers in place and putting people in place who have a long-standing track record of managing the economy in a more effective way during the 1990s and early 2000s.
Did he have to fire a load of people?
No, I think, people come in and out as presidents cycle in and out of office. And, Ahmadinejad and his closest advisors were, to put it diplomatically, not very popular across the board, both politically and in society. So it provided an opening to bring people in who have a demonstrated track record of being more competent managers.
Right, okay. So, Mohammed, if you were talking about what your president's done that you are most impressed by in the short span of 1 year, what would you point to?
The main challenge that Iran faces is obviously the United States. And the United States tried to, for years, depict that Iran is the problem, whereas from the Iranian perspective, the ball has always been in the American court. So in the past few years, the United States, whenever it wanted to continue with more sanctions against ordinary Iranians, they would say Iran is a threat. And whenever they didn't want to negotiate, they would say President Ahmadinejad has no authority. It's sort of paradoxical, because they'd say he's a threat to the world, but elsewhere they'd say he had no authority. President Rouhani, by changing the narrative, by changing the discourse in foreign policy, I think he put the Americans in a very difficult situation, and the consensus that the Americans were trying to build against Iran has been falling apart. Of course, this also coincides with the rise of ISIL, which is also very much
so Mohammed,
the United States has to be blamed.
I just asked you something
but in any case, I think he's done well.
I asked you something very, very specific, because I said, so what are you most impressed by? And then you went back to Ahmadinejad and also talked about America's relationship with Iran. But what are you impressed by what your president has done? The focus here has got to be on Iran right now.
Well, I think that's very important. He has had a very effective. He's represented Iran very effectively in the United Nations in his interviews, and his foreign minister has also done a very impressive job. And I think that's put the Americans in a very difficult situation. Countries no longer are very interested in the American narrative on Iran, and the sanctions regime and the attempt to build a consensus against Iran has impacted the economy, and it has impacted on has an impact on Iranians at all levels. So I think that's extraordinarily important what he's done, and I think that's a major achievement.
Malika.
Femi, Professor Mohammed said he represented Iran to the international community online. We're also hearing that same thing. Al Borz on Twitter says more Western delegations have visited Iran in the past 1 year under Rouhani than all previous years. So, Gissou, in terms of international foreign policy, have you been impressed?
I think, one thing that's coming out in these comments from both the online community and the people on the panel is comparing Rouhani to what came before. There's no question that they've increased the level of diplomacy. I mean, Ahmadinejad is really not a standard to compare Iran's president to. So, in terms of certainly at the UN, when I was there last year at the UN General Assembly about a year ago, you could see that countries in attendance were very impressed with the change in the Iranian delegation, the fact that they felt like they now have a real diplomatic partner to engage with. And that was something that was simply missing in the 8 years before. However, there are certain things that Rouhani promised on the campaign trail that go beyond simply resolving the nuclear issue and resolving the economic situation at home. And those include increasing personal liberties and freedoms. And I'm afraid that we haven't seen much advancement on that point, but the blame cannot be placed on Rouhani. It can be placed on the judiciary and other power brokers in the governmental structure in Iran that I think are really preventing those advancements.
Let me just remind you, there's a little clip here from the organization that you're just about to join, Gissou, which reminds us about some of the things that President Rouhani said during his election campaign. This one in particular about personal freedom. So have a listen to this.
National strength is realized when we provide freedoms to all of our people. Let us not interfere in people's private lives every day. If we want to uproot corruption in society, we must give freedom to the press and media. Viewing the arts as a security concern is the biggest mistake. Let us not allow people who have no relevant expertise to control books, films, and other cultural products. Many writers have been banned from writing. Proponents and opponents of government are both respected and dear to us. They have equal rights. We must tolerate diverse views.
So this was part of a campaign by the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran, Sharmine, and it actually, you'll see what the president is saying and then what actually happens. There's a little disconnect between those two things. So if we're looking at this first year, these amazing election campaign promises, and then what's been delivered as far as personal freedoms are concerned, does that give you any area where you're thinking, well, he did let Iranians down. He promised a lot, he delivered very little?
Well, you know, first years are always hard. Expectations are high, and it's very hard to sift through political waters in countries where the political process is quite contentious. I mean, look at U.S. President Obama. He promised us to shut down Guantanamo Bay in year one, and 6 years on, that hasn't happened. So there are many things that inhibit these kinds of things from moving forward. You know, but the question was, what is it I appreciate about what he's done the first year? And you know, this is a man who pledged to lower regional conflict and be a peace broker. And I think it's not what we expected from Iran. Those of us who know Iran better may be so, but certainly not the international community. And in year one, he's brought Iran in from the cold. And I think that's a significant achievement.
Reza.
I think both of these ladies are 100% right, and I think that speaks to a larger issue here, which is, one, you can't expect a president to achieve all he hopes to achieve within one calendar year. No president in any country can realistically do that. But also, it speaks to the fact that President Rouhani, long before he was ever president, was an inside baseball, behind-the-scenes political operator that prefers to get things done not at the podium, but behind closed doors, trying to create consensus within the Iranian system, whether you love it or you hate it. That's who he is. He's not like the former reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, who's going to give a very poetic speech at the podium, but perhaps not have the same political chops behind the scenes trying to get stuff done.
What are you hearing that he's doing behind the scenes? Let me just before you answer that, let me just show our audience something back here. This is known as the Rouhani meter. It was actually put together by a university in Toronto, the Monk School for Global Affairs, and they kept track of 73 reported promises that were made during the election, during campaign time, and they're just keeping track. It's only been just over a year. So far, 7 achieved, 26 in progress, 4 not achieved, and 36 nothing is happening out there. What do you think's happening behind the scenes?
That's a great meter. I hope they have a Harper meter in Canada, because they need one, Lord knows. I would say at the end of the day, what's going on behind the scenes is an effort, A, to try to get Mousavi and Karoubi, the 2009 presidential election candidates, out. That's not something that can be done at the podium.
So right now, just to remind people, they are
under house arrest, and they have been for far too long, and in my view, they never should have been under house arrest in the first place. I think this is something that Rouhani spoke about during his campaign. It's something he's been trying to achieve, but it's not something that's going to happen out in public. It's something that's going to happen behind the scenes. There's a lot of political horse trading going on, and should we be upset that it hasn't happened so far? Absolutely. Is he trying? In my mind, no question.
Sure.
Well, on things that people aren't that happy about, Gissou, we have this tweet from I Revolt. He says, since Mr. Rouhani took office, his regime, this person says, is hanging an average of 3 prisoners a day, the vast majority after unfair trials. And that's what this person tweeted us. But Gissou, we also have a video comment from someone named Maryam Malikpour, and her brother has been detained in Iran. She talks about personal freedoms and what she hopes for the future. Have a listen to this.
This October 4th will mark the 6 years Saeed has been locked up in Evin prison. I'm hoping and praying Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, hears me and do the right thing by releasing him from prison and conducting an investigation into his case. I hope Dr. Rouhani follows up my brother's case and doesn't leave him alone. Every day I pray for this nightmare to end.
So Gissou, she says every day she prays for this nightmare to end. When you hear stories like that, and you hear stories about human rights abuses, people say, what do you think?
Well, you know, Rouhani last year around this time was talking about a citizens' rights charter that his government was going to draft, and that this would secure minority rights, and that this would ensure that personal freedoms were respected in Iran. And what happened was that a draft document was released, which largely reinforced existing discriminatory laws and wasn't really anything new. Since then, the final document hasn't come out. But the reason that people like Maryam Malekpour and the families of people like Omid Kokabi, an Iranian scientist who has been jailed for several years now on unclear charges, the families of people like human rights lawyer Abdul Fattah Soltani and Mohammad Saifzadeh, these agents of change who are locked up on for unclear reasons. It's usually described as national security endangerment or propaganda against the regime. Right. They're looking for answers. And I should say that in respect to Rouhani, you know, since we're talking about what we want to see him do, he said last week when he was in New York in his interviews with Christiane Amanpour and with Fareed Zakaria, he said that all these cases are with the judiciary and that the judiciary is independent. Well, 2 points on that. First of all, the judiciary is not independent in the sense that the Ministry of Intelligence bears a great weight on judges and influences their decisions. Secondly, there is a lot, you know, the Iranian presidency is never an enviable position. The president comes in, there's a honeymoon period with the supreme leader who ultimately controls everything in the country. And then we see that towards the end of the president's tenure, there's really a souring of that relationship. Ahmadinejad fell out with the supreme leader. Khatami fell out with,
Gissou, you're debating with another interview that was on another TV show, but I want you to actually focus back here with us. I'm looking at President Rouhani's Twitter thread here. He also tweets in English, and back here he says, regarding human rights, believe country's atmosphere has actually improved since elections last year. And he says, I encourage a visit to our university campuses. So Gissou, while you were speaking, Mohammed was actually smiling. Mohammed, what do you know that we don't know? You're sitting there in Iran. What do you know about this human rights issue that maybe we're not getting from outside?
Well, I think that a lot of the comments that are being presented here are not really all that reflective of reality. Iran is not a dark and desperate place. There are many checks and balances in the system. The very fact that President Rouhani won an election with 50% of the vote and a turnout of over 70% shows how dynamic the system is and how popular the campaigns were and how people were involved in the campaign. 4 years ago, Mr. Ahmadinejad also won in a contest with a very high turnout.
So, Mohammed, nobody is questioning the popularity and how successful your president was during the elections. Nobody's questioning that. But the question of people being in prison, people not having a trial, human rights issues that Gissou just talked about right there, could you address those?
Well, no, because you're giving a specific example which I have not studied. I can tell you about an Iranian in the United States who was held in solitary confinement, Mr. Sayed Mahmoud Mousavi, held in prison for 3.5 years under trumped-up charges, and he just died last week, and I went to his funeral. He died of cancer that he got in solitary confinement in the United States, and I'm not quite sure how many of these human rights organizations have said anything about him.
I'm sorry, if I may.
Go ahead.
Well, the thing is, you're asking me a question about a particular case that I'm not involved in.
I don't have to ask the particular cases, but just this idea here, and this is your own president saying, I believe the atmosphere has actually improved since elections last year. What is he talking about? What is the improvement? I'm not talking about a specific case.
Well,
just a general
in general,
feeling that
I think
life is
that
better.
what has changed is that, well, Well, I think that in general, the feeling is that we have, since 5 years ago, the presidential election was contested. And after the elections, there were riots and there were protests by those who felt that there was fraud. By the way, President Rouhani has said repeatedly that there was no fraud in the previous election. And so have the leaders of the Mousavi campaign, who some of them are in the cabinet. But
Mohammed,
I think after this recent election, just one point, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
After this election, I think what happened that has changed the mood is that President Rouhani won the election with roughly 50% of the vote. No one challenged him. No one said there was fraud. All the other candidates accepted the results. And the debates were heated but very civil, contrary to 5 years ago. And I think that has matured. That shows that both the candidates as well as their supporters have behaved much more maturely.
All right, Mohammed, I'm going to squeeze some more of our community in because I don't want to get stuck on this election. I'm actually talking about the last year. Appreciate your thoughts, your take there. Let me just share the conversation just a little bit.
Right.
Malika.
Well, really picking up on what Professor Mohammed was saying, online people are saying actually it doesn't really matter because, Irfan tweets, Rouhani's a charming president, but we all know who's actually running Iran. That's Khamenei, that's the supreme leader, Ayatollah, and the Revolutionary Guard. Sharmine, another person says, doesn't matter. He serves at the whim of the supreme leader. He's just another worthless puppet head. Does it matter, Sharmine?
Yeah, you know, we're kind of going into the realm of canned narratives here. I mean, Khamenei is very powerful, but Iran is probably has the most dynamic political system in the entire region, bar Turkey, certainly much more than many of its neighbors. You know, they have diverse media and politicians who yell at each other in parliament and voice their dissent. You know, it's unfair to say that. And you know, there's a disproportionate amount of energy spent on Iran's human rights situation when this is a country that has been under the most severe prohibitive sanctions regime of all time, and is under siege on its various borders, you know, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from GCC countries that have Patriot missiles, you know, given by the United States, aimed at Iran. Exactly why are we focusing on the human rights issues ad nauseum? There's more to what Rouhani has to deal with, and they're far more pressing at a time when states, the territorial integrity of states around Iran are fracturing and states are fragmenting and disappearing from the map, you know? So I, for one, would like to move on.
Sure. It's interesting because we did a tally of the president's tweets since his inauguration, the ones he's been tweeting in English. And if you have a look here, you'll see perhaps where his focus lies. So about 16% of those tweets have been nuclear energy and relations with the West, 4% on the economy, and 5% on human rights, personal freedom, and government transparency. So that kind of backs up exactly what you were saying, Sharmine. Reza, where do you want to leave us before we wrap up this part of the show?
I don't ever think you can talk too much about human rights. I'd like to think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, Iran being under siege from sanctions and other forms of pressure is absolutely important and it needs to be addressed. But you know, international community more broadly and political leaders more specifically, it's their job to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's their job to balance these issues. So Rouhani is no exception to that rule. And other Iranian officials are no exception to that rule. Iran's human rights record is not good. They should be criticized for it. Rouhani has made improvements on Iran's foreign relations and in the nuclear negotiations. He should get credit for it.
Right.
Apples and oranges.
All right, that's Reza Marashi. He is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. We also have Gissou. She's the incoming director at the Iranian International Campaign, Sharmine Narwani, and also Mohammad Marandi. They're all coming with us to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. So on Monday, I am going to be on the other side of the Atlantic. So what's going to be happening on the Monday show?
You will be watching Monday show.
I'm always watching.
It will be interesting. We're tackling a very interesting topic, asking, is sexism in medicine killing women? Some say there's a gender bias in the way female patients are diagnosed and treated, and we'll discuss why on Monday. Until then, we'll see you online.